Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive?
Definitely. Always up for a good deep dive.
Okay, so today, well, it's a big one. We're taking on Letter from Birmingham Jail.
Oh, wow. Yeah,
It's one of those texts that it just stays with you. It's powerful.
absolutely. And still so relevant, even decades later.
Exactly. Like, think about it. It's 1963, right?
Right in the middle of the civil rights
It's a
movement.
huge moment in history. And Dr. King, he's in jail in Birmingham, Alabama.
For protesting segregation. Peacefully, I mean.
Yeah, peaceful protest. And yet, he ends up writing this incredible letter.
It's amazing when you consider the circumstances.
Right. And the core of it, I think, is this question. It's like, when do we obey the law? And when do we, actually have to disobey it?
Yeah, and it's not a simple question either. He's really pushing us to think about our moral obligations.
For sure. And I think what a lot of people don't realize is that this letter, it wasn't even meant for, the public originally.
Oh, you're right. It was a direct response to those 8 white clergymen.
Oh, the ones who were, criticizing him.
Exactly. They actually called him an outsider. Can you believe that?
Outsider. Wow. And that really makes you think, right?
Right.
Like, who gets to decide who's allowed to be an activist and who's not?
Yeah, who gets to draw those lines?
Exactly. So let's back up for a sec. Why was Birmingham King's fight? I mean, wasn't he based in Atlanta?
Okay, so King addresses this directly in the letter. He, dismantles this whole idea that injustice can be contained, like it has boundaries.
Okay, yeah.
He says injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So, it's all connected. He felt this obligation, he had to go.
You didn't just stand by and watch.
Yeah, and he compares it to, a biblical call, the Apostle Paul's Macedonian call for aid.
Wow. So it was that deep for him, like a moral imperative.
Absolutely. He saw the fight for equality as, this universal thing. It wasn't just about one place or one group of people.
And I guess that's what made him so effective, that sense of urgency. But he wasn't just, impulsive, right? He wasn't just rushing into things.
Yeah. No, not at all. King and his organization, the SCLC, they were known for their strategy, their approach to nonviolent resistance.
Right. Very meticulous.
Totally. And in the letter, he actually lays out these 4 key steps. First, you collect the facts, right? Then you try to negotiate, you purify yourself, and then only then is it direct action.
Okay, so they did their homework?
Oh, yeah. They researched everything about Birmingham. They talked to people, they prepared themselves. But then when they tried to negotiate with the city leaders, yeah, it was like hitting a wall. Resistance and broken promises. For instance, there was this agreement with some of the merchants, right?
Okay.
To postpone a boycott until after the mayoral election. But then they just broke the agreement. So it was like, what are you supposed to do?
Yeah, when you keep getting blocked and segregation is just continuing.
Exactly. It forces you to move to direct action.
And that's what led to his arrest.
Right. And even in jail, I mean, that's the thing. He doesn't back down at all. He uses this letter to really lay out his philosophy.
It's almost like the jail cell becomes this, platform.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know. There's so much that resonated with me in this letter, but one thing was his view on tension. It's like he saw it as a good thing.
Yeah, that's one of the most interesting parts. It's he's saying we need tension. We need that discomfort.
But isn't that, counterintuitive? I mean, we usually try to avoid tension, right?
He actually compares himself to Socrates, the Greek philosopher. He was always, pushing people's buttons.
Yeah, I remember him from Philosophy 101.
Right. So Socrates, he was called a gadfly, always poking at Athens, with all these uncomfortable questions, just like King was doing in Birmingham.
So it's not even just about tolerating tension. It's about actually creating it.
Exactly. King believed that, non-violent direct action, it creates this specific kind of tension, like a spotlight, shining on the injustices that people would rather just ignore.
Wow, that's a great way to put it.
It forces a community to confront the issue head on.
It makes me think about how real change happens. Usually comes from discomfort, from forcing people to see things they'd rather not.
Absolutely. It's that disruption that can lead to real progress.
And that leads right into his main argument, right? The difference between just laws and unjust laws. That's his whole justification for civil disobedience.
Right. And it's so important to understand his framework. For King, a just law, it has to align with moral law, what he called the law of God.
Got it. So moral law is the foundation.
Yeah, and then an unjust law is any human-made code that goes against those moral principles.
So basically, if it goes against your conscience, it's unjust.
He uses segregation laws as, like, the perfect example. He argues that they're degrading, They go against the basic equality of all people.
Yeah, and when you think about the impact of those Jim Crow laws, it's heartbreaking.
It affected everything. Where you could eat, where you could go to school, it was just...
It's hard to even imagine living under that kind of system.
And King was speaking directly to that experience. He was saying, these laws aren't just inconvenient, they're morally wrong.
They have to be challenged. And he doesn't just pull this idea of civil disobedience out of nowhere.
No, he connects it to history.
Yeah.
Like, he brings up figures like Socrates, who, defied Roman law, and even the Boston Tea Party.
Yeah. Throwing the tea into the harbor.
Right, and it's all about this long tradition of resisting unjust laws. He's showing that it's not some new radical idea. It's been happening for centuries.
It's a fight for freedom and justice that goes way back.
And he really emphasizes that freedom, it's never just given. You have to demand it.
Demand it from the oppressor. It's not going to be handed to you.
Exactly. And that brings us to, this whole idea of who was resisting him. It wasn't just people in power. It was also the white moderates.
Yeah.
And he seemed really let down by them.
Yeah, he really calls them out in the letter. Like, what was it about their approach that he found so frustrating?
He talks about this thing he calls the myth of time. This idea that, like, racial progress would just happen on its own with time.
Oh, so they were basically saying, just wait. It'll all work out eventually.
Pretty much. They wanted order. Gradual change. Even if it meant, keeping injustice alive for years and years.
And King saying, time isn't on our side. We have to make things happen.
Exactly. Time is neutral. You can use it to fight for justice, or you can use it to maintain the status quo.
And for him, waiting passively was like siding with the oppressor.
It was. He couldn't accept that. There was too much at stake. And then there's this other really fascinating thing. He embraces the term extremist.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting. It's a word that's usually meant to, like, discredit people, right?
Right, but he takes it and owns it. He's like, yeah, I'm an extremist.
But been an extremist for love.
Exactly. And truth.
Yeah.
And justice. He flips the whole script. He's saying it's not about being extreme in a bad way. It's about what you're extreme about.
I like that. What are you willing to fight for? What are your core values?
And are you willing to be extreme in defending them? He actually compares himself to some pretty radical figures, Jesus, Amos, Paul.
All considered extremists in their time.
Right. He's basically saying if being an extremist means standing up for what's right, then call me an extremist.
It's a powerful statement. And it makes you think about, where do you draw the line? What are you willing to fight for?
Absolutely. It's a challenge to all of us. And then there's this really poignant part of the letter where he turns his attention to the white church.
Yeah, his own community, in a way.
He expresses, like, this deep disappointment with their silence, their complicity in all of this.
I mean, that must have been incredibly painful for him, right?
Yeah.
To see the church not living up to its own values.
Absolutely. He talks about how they prioritized order over justice, how they were failing to live up to their own teaching.
About love and equality.
Exactly. And he contrasts them with these few, really courageous white clergy who did join the movement.
Those who put their beliefs into action.
Yes. He saw them as examples of true faith.
So even in his critique, he still held on to hope.
Yeah. He believed that the church could, reclaim its role.
Become this force for justice.
Be a beacon of hope.
It's like he was calling on them to be more than just, a building or a set of rules.
He wanted them to be a living example of love and justice in the world.
Powerful stuff. I mean, we've barely scratched the surface here, but I think we've set the stage. There's so much more to unpack in this letter, and we're going to do just that, so stay tuned.
It's an incredible journey, and we're just getting started. It really makes you think about, what our role is today, How do we respond to this call to action, even all these years later?
That's the big question, right? And he was writing from jail. That's where he was when he wrote all this. It's crazy.
And he talks about the police, too. I mean, that's a whole other layer.
Oh, yeah, that's something that's still so relevant. I mean, it feels like we're still dealing with police brutality and systemic racism.
Yeah.
Not much has changed. Did he just condemn all police?
Mm-hmm.
Or was it more nuanced than that?
It's actually really interesting. He makes a distinction, between those who uphold the law fairly and those who abuse their power.
Yeah.
He even praises some of the black policemen,
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like, Even though they were facing discrimination within the police force itself,
Okay.
they were still committed to justice.
So it wasn't about, like, hating all cops. It was about holding individuals accountable and recognizing the system, the system that allows this to happen.
Exactly. And he saw those black officers as, like, examples of integrity. It's like they're navigating this system that's rigged against them, but they're still trying to do what's right.
It's powerful.
Yeah, but he doesn't shy away from criticizing those who, use their badges to enforce segregation to be brutal.
He calls out Bull Connor specifically, right?
Yeah, Bull Connor, the public safety commissioner in Birmingham.
Yeah.
He was notorious.
He was the one with the fire hoses and the attack dogs.
Yeah, and it's like he was turning them on peaceful protesters, women, children. I mean, those images were everywhere. Everyone saw that.
I can't even imagine witnessing that. It's horrifying.
And that's exactly what King was talking about, right? The contrast, between how the police treated nonviolent protesters and then how they treated the white supremacists who were actually committing violence.
Yeah, they were given a pass, basically.
It's like the hypocrisy is it's staring you in the face.
And that takes us back to his whole point about order versus justice, doesn't it?
Totally. True peace, he argues, it can't exist without justice. You can't just use force to suppress dissent. It's like you're just making the problem worse.
Yeah, you're putting a Band-Aid on a gaping wound. It's crazy how relevant this all feels to today, like with all the conversations about police reform and racial justice.
It's like we're still having the same conversations. We're still dealing with the legacy of that injustice.
Letter from Birmingham Jail.
Yeah.
Almost feels like a guidebook or something, a blueprint for how to address these issues.
It's timeless, that's for sure. It's a call to action and it's a call for reflection. Like, what is our role in all of this?
How do we be better citizens, better human beings?
Big questions. Where do we even begin?
I know, right? It's overwhelming.
I think, honestly, one of the most important takeaways is that thing about interconnectedness. Remember how King talks about that? We're all connected. We can't just be indifferent to injustice, even if it's not happening to us directly.
Yeah, that whole outsider label. They were trying to silence him, but he turned it into this, call for solidarity.
Yeah, like, you can't tell me I don't belong here. Because injustice anywhere affects us all. And his call to action, it's still so powerful. Waiting for change isn't enough.
We have to make change happen.
With our words and with our actions.
And that doesn't have to be like this huge dramatic thing. It can be everyday choices, right?
Absolutely. Like challenging discriminatory language when you hear it.
Yeah.
Educating yourself about social justice. Supporting organizations that are doing the work. It's about showing up. Being engaged.
Yeah, putting in the effort. And King reminds us about, the power of love and forgiveness.
Yeah, he wasn't advocating for nonviolent resistance because he was weak. It came from this deep belief in love's ability to overcome hate.
It's almost like a radical idea.
Yeah.
That love can actually dismantle these systems of oppression.
I know. It's hard, especially when you're facing so much hate and violence yourself. But it's something to strive for.
Definitely. And I keep thinking about the role of faith in all of this. It's all over this letter.
His faith was everything to him. It kept him going through everything. The imprisonment, the threats, the violence. It's like he was drawing strength from this long tradition of, faith-based resistance.
And he didn't hold back from criticizing those who used religion to justify segregation. He was like, true faith requires you to act.
Exactly. You can't just sit there and be complacent. Faith without works is dead.
Right. Exactly. And that applies to everyone, I think. No matter what you believe. It's about aligning your actions with your values.
Yeah.
And having the courage to stand up for what you know is right, even when it's hard.
Speaking of courage, there's this part in the letter where he talks about, being in jail and he's having dinner with some of his fellow activists and they start singing.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. It's such a beautiful image.
It's just this powerful moment of, finding joy, even in the midst of all this struggle.
Yeah, and it speaks to that sense of community. That strength that comes from being together, facing those hard times together.
And it goes back to that idea of, the unsung heroes, the people whose names we don't know. But they're the ones who are really driving the movement.
They're putting everything on the line. It's hard to even fathom, facing that kind of violence, that constant fear.
And King talks about that, right? Those who clung to the myth of time, they just didn't get it. They didn't understand the urgency.
For those who were living it every day, waiting wasn't an option.
They were living on a different timeline, a timeline marked by struggle and, honestly, terror.
Their strength came from the urgency of the moment, from their community, their faith.
And knowing that their actions, even the small ones, they were part of something bigger. They knew that time, it's not on the side of the oppressor, it's on the side of those fighting for justice.
That's a powerful message for all of us. We all have a role to play.
Even our seemingly small actions, they contribute to the movement.
It's inspiring, but it's also like a heavy responsibility, when you think about the sacrifices they made.
And King acknowledges that. He knows people are tired. He knows they're tempted to give up.
But he says despair, that's a luxury we can't afford.
Exactly. The fight for justice, it demands everything, even when it feels impossible.
He's basically saying we can't quit, not when so much is at stake.
And he points to the progress that has been made, the cracks in the system, as proof that the struggle is working.
It's not in vain.
The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And it's our job to keep bending it.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Letter from Birmingham Jail, what's like the one thing you want our listeners to walk away with?
I would say just take some time to really sit with King's words, see how they connect to the things we're facing today.
Like, what are the injustices that we're seeing around us right now?
Are we part of the problem? Or are we part of the solution?
And how do we find the courage to be real agents of change?
It's about action. It's about commitment.
Letter from Birmingham Jail. It's not just some historical document. It's a living call to action. It reminds us that the fight for justice, it's never really over. And it's up to all of us to keep it going.
To keep pushing for a better world.
Thank you all for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep fighting for a more just world.